week has looked the same for generations, before the pandemic, that is. According to several recent surveys, almost 50% of respondents now want companies that allow for flexible work weeks. To discuss this new era of a hybrid work environment, joining me are Gail Heimann, CEO of Weber Shandwick, and Devika Bulchandani, North America CEO and Chairwoman at Ogilvy. Welcome, Gail. Welcome, Devika.
So good to be with my friend Gail Heimann.
Reunited, and it feels so good.
Reunited. So my first question to you is, New York is opening up. Where do you guys stand in terms of reopening of the offices?
New York is opening, and we are here in the flesh. So I'm totally glad for that and appreciate it. And it's funny you mentioned flexibility and new needs of the workforce, and people have been discussing this transforming workforce for years, eons, and here we are, Devika and I and a few others, actually changing it. So it is an exciting time. Where we are is we will be opening up. It is likely we will be opening up in mid-fall. What we have done, we are open in places all around the world. We're a vast, like Ogilvy, we are a vast global network. So we are open in parts of Asia Pacific, and we are open in parts of Europe. We are not yet open in LATAM because of the reasons of a resurgence. And we are not yet open in North America. We have told our teams that we will give them ample time to resort the lives that they have been leading. So it is likely we will be opening our doors, given with CDC regulations, with local regulations, and with a lot of listening to our teams in mid-fall.
What about you guys, Devika?
Now, I think the one thing we've all learned during COVID is never make a plan. Anyway, having said that, we will also be opening in September in the US. And I think to echo a lot of what Gail was saying, there have been different aspects or different geographies where we've been open and then we've been closed, and then we've been open and then we've been closed. And that's sort of the thing with COVID where you can't make a plan. In the US, we will open in September and get people back. We've also done the same thing. I think a lot of us have the same policies to give people ample notice. We have a plan in place for more of a flex work environment. And there's an added complication for us in New York because we're moving from what was called the Chocolate Factory to 205th, which is actually the Toy Design Center. Now it's the Toy Factory. So very similar again. Come early, mid-September, we'll be getting back to the office in some shape or form. And we can talk more details about that.
Moving from chocolate to toys. That's
Isn't that fun?
big move.
Well, I take the creative juices flowing, am I right? Yeah. So we talked about how nearly 50% of respondents of a recent survey, and plenty of surveys actually, demand that of their employers now. What does that sort of a hybrid work environment look like for Weber Shandwick?
So, it's interesting that I assume that's national data you're talking about. Weber Shandwick data was give or take 3/4 of our teams, 3/4 of our individuals around the world said flexibility is what they want. So on or about December 12, we announced that we were going to hybrid in perpetuity, a program called JUICE. Get it? It's about fluidity. It's called JUICE. And what that is it's 60-40. So for most people, we'll be very flexible, but for most people, that means 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. And while I know there's all kinds of talk about how hybrid works for others and what by job or by the kind of work you're doing on a given day, ours is super democratic for everyone across every title, no matter what he or she or they are doing. It is that kind of hybrid, 3 and 2. JUICE has other components too. We have deals on food, on health, on yoga, and all kinds of other things that help people in that hybrid work environment. There's a whole range of components that I think make it a little bit different, and the response has been great. So flexibility, in perpetuity, fully democratic. I should say the other thing that I think is really important about it, we talk a lot about carbon emissions and stuff like that. When we go to that kind of approach, it's not only affords flexibility, ideally super inclusive flexibility, which is a whole other component of the JUICE program.
We will get there.
Yeah, and we'll get there, I'm sure. But the other piece is when you take thousands of people and you change their commutation patterns and reduce them, each of them, by 2 days a week, you reduce your carbon emissions. So that's a big piece of JUICE as well.
What is the Ogilvy version called? Flow or something?
We've got actually 5 different elements in sort of our new plan. The first is how you work, which is also a 3-2 model, right? So I think everybody's looking at a 3-2 model. We're also looking at a 3-2 model which is going to be fairly democratic in its need. There's another sort of interesting dynamic that comes into play when you think about how you work, is real estate footprints. And I think organizations in different markets, we've also shrunk our real estate footprint because that allows us to reinvest into different areas of the business and reinvest into our people and what they need going forward. So that's going to be a factor. Not every office in every region is doing it, but Gail, I'm sure you guys have thought about that some, and we're dealing with sort of the same issue. The second is where you work. So even the flexibility of, if I am working in New York, do I have to be located in New York? Right? We've also found flex work means more than just how many days a week you are, but where you work.
The banks say you do,
right?
We've read that.
Yeah. So there's there's that aspect to it, which is the second component. The third is who you work with. I think what we're finding is, as people are more lonely, you want to have cohorts. So we've actually launched 18 new ERGs, right? Every organization, again,
over the past year?
Yes. We've come to 18 now. So I think there were, 7 or 8 earlier. But as the last year has unfolded, or the last 18 months, and different needs and different issues have arisen from an employee and stakeholder perspective. So we're up to 18 ERGs, because who you work with, having that sense of commonality becomes really important. Are you a veteran? Are you, is there a disability issue? Are you a working mother? Right? But that sort of sense of community when you've been sitting alone at home has become really important. So that's the third, which is who you work with. How you feel, which is not something that we, as an industry, we talk about it a lot, but I'm not sure we've been, how good we've been about really thinking about how people feel. So we have a program in that bucket called 100% You, which has, again, 4 components to it, which is, how do you feel about money? How do you feel about meals? How do you feel about movement? And how do you feel about your mind, mental health? And we have actually experts and outsiders coming in to do a program every Wednesday on one of those 4 issues. And then the last one is how you relax. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to institute is compulsory 3 days off every quarter.
Wow.
Because the US actually leaves over 400 million days on the table. And I know one of the things, and I know when I was at IPG, we talked about, going to a no vacation policy, as in take whatever you want. But what we're finding in conversations and in some of the data that we're seeing is people actually feel more pressure and they don't know what days to take off. Can I not? So what we're instituting now is 3 compulsory days off, because taking care of our minds and mental health is one of the biggest issues that's facing this nation and the biggest issues that's facing the workforce.
That's definitely a huge change, especially in an industry notorious for overworking its people. I want to turn the question around to the other end of that, though. We always talk about how important it is in the creative industries to be there in the same physical space for collaboration and creativity to thrive. How does the physical office space then evolve to sort of adapt to this sort of a hybrid work environment?
Yeah, I mean, there is no question there is electricity when we're together in a room. Like, we could have been doing this panel on our laptops with little squares in it. Wouldn't have had the profound electricity.
I would get to hug you.
Right. There'd be no hugs, there'd be no electricity. So there's certainly value. I think we found, and I suspect Devika will agree, that we had extraordinary creative developed and made in this last period, right? I mean, it can happen. And I think there was
I think Cannes is witness to that. If you just think about the week we're in.
We've seen it in Cannes, and the virtual world was very democratic. Lots of people had voices. Lots of people shaped ideas. It was truly inclusive. And I think we've got to continue that. We got to retain that. That said, to get to the office space question, yeah, I think it makes sense that it will be a creative nexus. It will be a collaboration nexus. It will be a team nexus, whether one is on a creative side or whatever side of that business is on. Coming together as a team, if that team is within a single office, I think will be valuable. I think it remains to be seen. One of my colleagues said, the office of the future is just a cafe, like a cafe with a bunch of rooms, and people get together and they'll have lattes and they'll hang and they'll do whatever. Maybe it turns into something else in the evening, or maybe it's just a yoga studio, or maybe it's cafes plus a yoga studio. It will morph. I think what we are looking at now is betaing all kinds of technologies to be sure that those who are not in that office, in that nexus at the time, are included, because the FOMO thing is a big issue. So I think technology will compensate a bit. So when you're in the groovy banquette in one of our offices and hanging and having a random serendipitous meeting, you can call in your colleagues and they're there for everyone to see, not on a singular laptop. So I think we're looking at that. There are some terrific technology solutions. We're looking at all of them. But overall, I think, creative nexus, collaboration nexus, and for sure team nexus, and client and team nexus. So those are the things we're looking at.
To you, Devika, so you were talking about mandating 3 days off as a compulsory policy per quarter. What about the opposite of that? Would you have, for creative teams, you have to be in 2 days a week, or any policies around that to make sure that you're still fostering that sort of a collaborative work environment?
I think, what we're doing is going to a 3-2 model for everybody. Again, we have to dip our toe in the water, get back, and see how it works. Right? Nobody in the world's figured this out because it's never happened in the world before, and thankfully it didn't.
Yeah.
So we're going to learn, and then we're going to adapt to it. And that's one thing that we're being super transparent about. And I think that's just the reality. I'm not sure anybody has the answers. Yeah. We've been really lucky in one thing, and I'd say this about Ogilvy, New York, we're moving. So when you're moving in this moment, you get to design a space for the future, which is easier to do than taking an existing space, right, and then redesigning it. So when we think about 205th, we're redesigning the whole space to be more fluid, to be more juicy, to take
That's good. I love it as an adjective.
Right, it's going to be more juicy. And they're not, it's not a fixed space, and it'll be a lot more like neighborhoods, which is you come into your neighborhood because you're not going to be there every day. And even looking at the design being more fluid. Mm-hmm. So can we move walls? Can we actually make things smaller and make things bigger? And it doesn't have to be just walls, but what do you do with bringing nature in? And what do you do with bringing different textures in? Having said all of that, which sounds really exciting, and the plans are underway because that office is not going to be fully ready till January, which all our teams know. The technology, to Gail's point, is going to make it or break it as we all collectively think about the future of work and the hybrid workplace. Because we've all had a very shared and democratic experience. It didn't matter who you were, where you were. We were all on Zoom and Teams and WebEx. And it was a shared experience with our clients, right? I do worry about a situation, which is you've got a client that's come into the office. We're all sitting around a table and we're ideating, right? And you're sitting there and you're talking. And our business is a business where ideas build, right? Where Gail says something and you go, wait a minute, you said something. And you think about it. Now, 7 of us are in a room together in this beautiful, juicy environment, and 3 are not. Okay. And even if there's a technology, there's still a screen. Mm-hmm. Now, all of a sudden, we have the physical proximity and the electricity that goes with it. And as much as technology can do, there are still going to be people behind a screen. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to learn to live with it. Learn to
solve for it.
Or solve for it, right? Yeah. And the other bit of it is our own muscle memory. Because when I'm with you, when I'm talking to you, it's so much easier to do it and we build off each other. And then to go, hey, John, Joanna, what do you think?
Right.
That muscle memory that we're going to have to learn is going to be sort of a different thing. And we've all lived through this, right? Conference calls.
Nobody remembered the people on the phone. Hey, remember Harold? He's on the phone. You're like, I forgot.
So both of you talked a lot about technology and how instrumental it's going to be moving forward. We've all heard about Zoom fatigue and that being a really big phenomenon. So what are some other technologies that you're considering, just as tangible examples?
Well, we're not to do shout outs for all the technology. We're looking at a lot of them. I do think there's a couple ways to look at it. One is what is the technology replacement for the video conference, the standard issue kind of Zoom, WebEx, Teams, et cetera. And there's other things out there more akin to gaming, right? So are we looking at some of those kinds of things? And I know other kinds of businesses are using those, some with reasonable success. So we're taking a look at that. There's a lot of discussion out there about multiplayer systems and synchronous and asynchronous, with Google Docs being an example of synchronous. So you got to do both, right? And we all have a bit of that, but the greatest opportunity to work together is in that single doc where you literally are working together and collaborating together. So to change a little bit of the gestalt of our organization, I think, to get to full-on synchronous, a little bit of asynchronous, but it's hard to drive that evolution. And at the same time, be looking at some of these systems that are a little bit more multi-dimensional than classic Zoom and Teams. And again, those systems have been great. They've been great for us. They've been great for our clients. God knows we've gone from platform to platform. I mean, I can spend a day not running out of the room, just going platform to platform to platform and hoping they all work. But those are all very similar. So I think the new age is going to be a little more immersive, a little more gaming-like, and those are the ones we're testing now.
Devika, I want to ask you about any sort of leadership or operational skills that you were forced to develop over the past year that you didn't have earlier. What would those be? And then how are you applying them to your colleagues, to your clients, to your stakeholders?
I mean, hell yes, right? Like if we didn't learn anything in the last year, then I don't know, all of us were sort of living under a rock. I mean, I think the first one that I'm going to talk about, which may sound almost cliched, is empathy. You see somebody on screen and it all seems okay because we're on screens and all I see is this, right? And I've had to really sort of think about, even when I sit with you right now, I can see that you're injured, right? I have cues for empathy to be triggered. But when all I'm seeing is this aspect of Gail, how do you intuit what's actually going on? Every single person was dealing with some form of trauma, some form of hardship. That's been something that I had to teach myself, which is when I can't visualize something, when I cannot see it, how can I trigger empathy in ways? How do I ask the kinds of questions that can give me the information I need so that we can be doing more than just talking about work and understanding where people are coming from? I mean, I'll give you one sort of small example of it. My biggest observation was working mothers. So the children would come on screen and nobody knew how to deal with it in the beginning. And it was like, oh my God, so cute. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Oh my God, go away, right? I mean, there was all sort of these awkward moments. And then I realized a pattern. That was a child would come on screen and what a mother would do immediately is apologize. And I started thinking about this and just think about it from a child's perspective. So the mother's saying, I'm so sorry, I'm disturbing a meeting. Oh my God, he just came back from school. And then just apologizing profusely. So I started thinking about this and I said, let's think about that child for a minute. What does the child take away? That my mother apologized for me. What does that mean when you apologize for somebody? Are you ashamed? Right? So you start actually thinking about the psychology of that one apology in front of a child. It is really sort of heart-wrenching. So I tell every single mother, I tell every single father, please do not apologize for your children. I stop a meeting when a child comes in, talk to the children. It's 5 seconds, by the way. And inevitably, they're so shy. But I've really been sort of militant in drilling this in. And I do it all the time, too. It's like, oh, my God, I'm so sorry. And then I'm like, no, I'm not sorry. But little things like that are really important for leaders like us, right? To instill and to enact it ourselves so that people will say that, you're serious about it. That's one example of a new thing I'd learned and thinking about just the impact on.
Gail, what would you say your big
and I totally agree, and it's such a great point around not apologizing for your kids, and you're right, that is a tendency we saw it. For sure, it's about empathy, and I think for us, we've always talked about leading by listening, and we've always tried to live by that, and hopefully do. And listening typically happens in a big way, right? You're listening to what's going on in culture, or you're listening to your surveys that you're doing, as many did throughout the pandemic. But I think it's a little bit about listening small, right? It's about listening to individuals and doing it in an agenda-free way. I think so much of what we experienced in the Zoom world is an agenda. Hey, I am sending you this invite. You will come. Here is what we will talk about. And virtual gave us this opportunity to talk to hundreds of people you wouldn't usually talk to because you're not flying around and you're doing whatever. So people who would never expect you to talk to them and have no agenda. I have no agenda. Just how are you doing? Like what's happening? What's exciting you? what are you anxious about? That kind of thing. And I mean, I tried, and I know our senior leadership team tried to do that every day, multiple times, just to listen. And importantly, both when you're listening big and listening small, respond and take some action. I mean, so it's not simply listening in this period of time proved that listening is important, but you've gotta take the action.
What about operationally? There are aspects of our jobs we don't miss. We don't miss hopping on planes. It's probably not that fruitful to be flying to the south of France every summer. What are operational changes that you think you will want to maybe retain from the pandemic era?
Well, I think when, again, we talked about this changing workforce in the middle of the pandemic. We hired a C-suite level individual who is the Chief Workforce Innovation Officer. And his job is to really focus on everything we're talking about and push us into a leadership position and in a leadership position around not only the transformation, but in a transformation that puts inclusion at the heart. If you're working in a dispersed way, that becomes how do you do that and how do you do that well? So I don't think we will go back to a place where we don't put that at the very top of a company as a critical need state that we have to solve for and continue to evolve. We also hired a Chief Impact Officer, and that was April 1, so kind of the beginning of the pandemic, and brought him in to fuse creativity and strategy, but also a little bit as a result of the need state of our clients, right? I mean, here we are in these very tough circumstances, solving for many, many issues and looking to get impact in very different ways. The other piece, and I think this came out as we talked to client after client, the need to solve at the intersections and therefore put together agile, cross-functional teams to bring that ability to clients again and again and embed those into our more classic client teams. And that's what we're doing. So that's a real evolution for our business. And I think it's hugely important. Deb, what did you do?
The first thing I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to miss heels.
I hear you.
Operationally, there's going to be a big change. It's never going to be a requirement for anybody. There are a lot of things that we did because they were always done. It just sort of felt like the status quo, right? Like 8 people went to a meeting because that's what you did. Mm-hmm. There were things that were just like, this is part of being in this industry. And I think one of the questions that I'm asking myself and I'm asking sort of our team all the time is, as we're thinking about it, is just because we did it doesn't mean we're going to do it again, right? So things like, do 8 people need to travel to a meeting? Let's ask ourselves why. And we're doing a lot more of questioning the little things so that we understand how we operationalize or create new sort of operational policies. The flex workplace is exactly a result of all of that. But it's really funny that Gail talked about a Chief Impact Officer because we're about to announce one.
Oh, is this breaking news?
This is going to be breaking news. I mean, I guess I have to take a step back and say, Andy and I both new to Ogilvy, and one of the first things we obviously did is figure out like what the brand stands for. It's one of the most iconic brands. And going back and having read everything David Ogilvy wrote, there's a lot of sort of core tenets of this brand. And our mission moving forward is to inspire brands and people to impact the world. And it's funny, Gail talked about intersection because that's exactly what we're talking about. Integration is not the way of the future because that's a process. And we do have 5 businesses. And we've restructured the entire P&L system, which has been a big barrier in our industry, right? And this is the beauty of actually having Andy, who comes at it from a different perspective. And we've really rethought our entire P&L structure so that we can have these 5 businesses operated. And we say we're going to innovate, operate at the intersection of people, of capabilities, and geographies, right? And I think it's really important to talk about the people aspect of it too. One of the things I've been telling everybody is when you have a group of people together, just say, can I have somebody else? Think about it. Is a perspective missing in this room? Not just gender, not just race. Is a perspective missing? Because sometimes that perspective could be a disability. The next question you ask is a capability missing? Actually, if I had a different skill set, would this team be better? And then the third question you say is, am I just thinking about New York or should I be thinking about somebody from our Minneapolis office?
Right.
Which is, so people, capabilities, geography.
So a couple of things that were raised in the last couple of questions that we were talking about. Obviously, the pandemic also brought to the fore a lot of fissures in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of sex, in terms of disabilities. We talked about some ways that you're addressing them. What are areas you think that still need improvement, and how do you plan to tackle them as a leader?
As it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and issues of race, everything needs improvement, right? And we are working on it. We are making progress, but it is a journey, as everyone says, and that is true. And I don't want to simplify it, but it is about, from an organizational point of view, it's about structure and infrastructure, and it's about culture, right? And if we look at infrastructure, for us, it's taking a look at everything we do from a hiring point of view, from a recruiting point of view, from an evaluation point of view, from a where you sit in the organization physically, when you're in the organization physically, and deconstructing and reconstructing. And we have a team of people under Brian Offit and working closely with Brian Offit, who is our Chief Workforce Innovation Officer, doing that. When it gets to culture, it's about training. And I know, most organizations have invested in, like ours, in significant amounts of training. For us, it's about cultural competency training at a senior level. It's about unconscious bias training throughout the organization, Black experience training, which has been incredibly meaningful for our teams in doing that. And then it's about the kinds of things we do as an organization, the way we thread our work. Like Devika's organization, we are working with major organizations, industries, governments, et cetera. So we have this opportunity to make change to doing that. We also made a commitment of $1 million in resources to focus around health equity. So we were doing that because for sure, as we look back on these last 18 months, the fragility and vulnerability in our system really, if one remembers nothing, whether we will remember everything from these moments in time, we will remember that. And I believe we can make a difference there by focusing on it. So we are focused as an organization there and making a difference and focused structurally and culturally. And there's a lot to do. Again, a little progress, but a lot to do.
Devika, so you want to talk about this a little bit more?
Yeah. I think the first thing I just want to echo what Gail said. Everybody's making baby steps and taking putting one foot forward. And that's the important sort of beginning. And that's important that we keep doing it every day. We have so much work to do. So everything that I'm going to talk about or Gail talked about, in no way do I want everybody, anybody out there who's viewing this to think, oh my God, we're doing awesome. No. Second point, I'd say ditto. I don't need to repeat a lot of what Gail said because we're all doing a lot of similar things. One thing that I'd add that we're doing is, it's interesting as you talk about infrastructure and you talked about culture, the tangible conduit sometimes are very often are the managers, right? And you need to have the right managers, you need to have the right representation there, but what's the right training for those managers? So we're actually taking 250 of our most senior people and creating a mindful manager program so that we, the top 250 people at Ogilvy, are fully trained and understand how to deal with these issues and be much more mindful. Because it's great, I can put everything in PowerPoint, I can create sort of the cultural tenets and the elements and have, the 5 C's or the 4 W's, and all of us have that. But till the human beings who are leading the teams and the groups are not mindful, don't believe it is something that they need to live, eat, and breathe and be able to portray every day, it's not going to happen. So that's one thing that we are investing in that's going to kick off very soon.
So you also talked about how your own business is changing, right? So you talked about the new P&Ls and you're also working on, correct me if I'm wrong, but a new form of compensation, which the industry has sort of resisted based on how you perform. Let's reverse that. How are your clients' businesses changing? What are some things that you've had to teach yourselves to adapt to how the clients' businesses evolve?
Look, agility, and I feel like we got a dose of acceleration on how to be much more agile. We've always talked about it in the industry, but the reality is we've never had an event where we've needed to accelerate it to the degree that we've had to do now, right? So, because the whole world was in it together, every single client, doesn't matter who it is, a government client, national client, a local client, a retail client, a food client, somebody whose business shut down, or somebody who was open. But every business had a systemic shock. And the only way to be the true partners to them was to be agile in a way that we have never seen, whether it comes to agility of thinking, whether it comes to agility of ideation, agility of production. How do you produce in a world where we couldn't send people out, right? There was a really interesting example of some work that we did in the Middle East where we had to shoot a car commercial, and we actually did it with a toy car. I actually think that's some of the most creative thinking in some ways, right? So that's been super important. Just a sense of partnership, right? We've had to do things and not worry about whether it was in scope, not in scope. All of that sort of went out the window when you think about just our own business. Mm-hmm. And we talk about partnership very often, and we're asking clients to be true partners to us. And this was a moment that tested our partnership to them as well, right? Because we are in the service business. So that sense was hugely important to us.
And listen, we are in violent agreement. as you know, it's interesting on the agility piece. We do client surveys, again, as many organizations we do when we do them annually. And for as long as I can remember, the top 2 things clients look for are strategy and creative. Every year it shifts a little, strategy and creative or strategy. This year it was agility. For all the reasons that Devika says. And that's for sure what we've been doing. And client relationships, again, to the point you made, a little bit because of empathy and this shared experience, I think have never been stronger. The piece I think that's a little bit different from a from a Weber Shandwick point of view, because if asked who Weber Shandwick is, we will say we are born in PR and built to solve our clients' most complex problems. And that is true, and that's how we built the organization. And for us, the notion of intersectionality came to play because you look at what happened in these last 18 months, and it was a collision of crises, frankly. It was a public health crisis and an economic crisis and a crisis around racial injustice and an information crisis and a mental health crisis and all of those crises. So for us, it was building those agile teams that could solve at the epicenter of those crises. And we have been counseling on issues of diversity and issues of communication around vaccination and issues early on, or issues of communication around COVID. And not only at the comms level, also at the supply chain level, and helping clients figure those things out. So really complicated problems that kind of worked at the nexus of policy and technology and media and culture. And I don't think we'll go back. I mean, that's where clients' need state have changed. They've become more complex. They've become more intersectional and intertwined. And we've got to, I think all of us as an industry, as a marketing services industry, have to be able to comport ourselves to address those issues.
Yeah, I think you're 1,000% right, Gail. Nobody comes to us. A client's not coming to us anymore and saying, here's my advertising problem, here's my PR problem, here's my digital experience problem.
They're coming to you and saying, this is my problem.
And their problems are at the intersection of many different aspects of their own business, right? Because all the forces are colliding. And clients have the same issues we have. They had social justice issues, and how do they go to market with their brands or their services or their products? And do they do something or do they not do something? One of the things I think it's interesting is, I think Gail comes from a world where crisis management is in her bloodstream. And I feel like I just learned crisis management, or had like this PhD in crisis management in the last year, which has been a really, really sort of interesting experience.
We are all crisis managers.
That's that's what you do, right?
I think that's a fabulous point to end on. So if I were to summarize everything that we've discussed today, there's a collision of forces. There's no one way to do anything or business anymore. It's all about intersectionality. You've learned a lot of agility moving forward, and the future workforce is not just going to be one that is flexible. It's also going to be one that takes into account multiple experiences, whether it comes to race or sex or disability. Thank you so much for joining me, Devika and Gail, and thank you so much for this amazing discussion that we had.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.